There's every economic motivation to find another vineyard, because I'm absolutely certain that I could raise $500 million in less than a week if I promised a group of investors that I could find a modern-day Latache. And the fact that there is all this money that would be happy to invest in something that could in fact duplicate Latache, or at least equal the quality of Latache, then why hasn't it been done? Now that's asking someone to prove a negative, but the fact that it hasn't been done, I think, suggests that while not impossible, it's not for lack of looking. But more importantly is to give you the philosophical precept of why terroir exists, or at least why I believe it exists, and why it has remained with us. Another argument that people make against terroir is to say that it's just a sophisticated French marketing system. All right, that's an argument. However, think of it this way. If I, or somebody, let's say the Growers Association in Burgundy, asked each one of you, look, design a marketing strategy for the wines of Burgundy. And do whatever you want to. You have this, the Côte d'Or is just blank, and you can do it any way you want to. It is beyond inconceivable, to me anyway, that anyone would come up with the current system of dividing all these vineyards into little tiny holdings with the Napoleonic Code making sure that within these little tiny vineyards that you got 34 growers in 5 or 6 acres. Who would do that? I mean, it just makes no sense. And so, while I'm perfectly willing to take on faith that somebody could argue, I don't believe in terroir, but I don't accept that it's just a sophisticated marketing strategy, because it's the least sophisticated thing in the world. It's massively complicated. Nobody understands it. I'm even having to run back to the books from time to time. Really? I didn't know that. Because there are all these nuances. I mean, nobody would design it that way. But let me take you back to the beginning, and then I promise that I'll walk you through the wines. But back in the beginnings, there was a concept known as animism. And animism is something that the Druids, for those of you that may remember history way, way back when, there was a group that was called the Druids. And these Druidic concepts had to do with animism. And animism, in and of itself, is the notion that there is a spirit that inhabits each and every being and each and every object. So animate, inanimate, doesn't matter. There's a spirit that lived there. And in fact, the church adopted this, because when they were trying to convert pagans, they decided to at least keep some of their customs. Well, one of them was the notion of animism. Now, they modified the notion of animism so that the spirit that they talked about was the spirit that is in each of us, or so the teachings would suggest, as well as the spiritual aspects of Jesus Christ, the angels, God, etc., etc. But what was important here is that when the vineyards started being planted in Burgundy, it wasn't a surprise when they noticed that the wines from here didn't taste the same as the wines from here. And they weren't surprised by this. And the reason that they weren't surprised by this is this notion of the spirit that lived there wasn't the same as the spirit that lived here. But that was going on before the church. So what did the church bring to the table to propagate this notion of terroir that still is with us today? And some would argue that it's the only thing that's important in wine. Other people, like I said, would argue that it doesn't matter. But it's a pretty strong statement to think that there are people who would say it's the only thing that matters in wine. You know, preserving that aspect of terroir, if you do that, you've made a unique wine. So how did it get from this notion of, yeah, okay, they're different, so what? How did it get from that to this esteemed notion that we have today. Well, that's where the church comes in, and they were responsible for saying, rather than blending, because roughly 90 to 95% of all wines are blended. So why would you have a region that is monocépage? Well, monocépage meaning that only one grape variety. There's one for white, one for red. Well, what they did, and here's the key contribution. Now, they made a lot of contributions, but in my mind, the key contribution of the church when it comes to the wines of Burgundy was, rather than saying, well, those differences are interesting, but let's put them together, or let's bring in another grape variety. They said, no, 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 no. Those differences are a message from God. And as a consequence, we need not only to preserve those differences, but, and here's the key, they need to be celebrated. We need to understand why the message here is different from the message here. And so, as they did what was the equivalent of prospecting for terroir, they started to say, well, those are different. We're going to draw a line here. And so they constructed, and don't forget, the monks were an educated class. They had endless amounts of labor, and all the mistakes they had a use for, because they could use them in their rituals. So if the wine didn't turn out well, and this not only, by the way, was prospecting on a viticultural level, dirt, but also in winemaking technique and viticultural technique. So the monks were huge drivers of improvement in wine quality, but their enduring legacy is this notion of that's different from that over here, and guess what? That matters.